The only light in the room was a tallow candle my mother-in-law had left on the windowsill. I remember watching the wax run down the side and pool on the wood because I did not know where else to look. My good dress was folded over the back of the chair. Downstairs I could still hear the men's voices, low and satisfied, and the sound of dishes being carried back to the kitchen. And beside me, on a bed his father had built for this exact night, sat my husband. He was 24 years old. I was 19, and neither of us said a single word for what felt like a very long time. What happened in that room I understood as my duty. What happened in that room every Sunday night for the next 11 years I understood as law. What I did not understand, not for a very long time, was that what I was living inside had a shape, that it had a name, that women in other beds, in other counties, in other decades, had lived inside the same shape and also said nothing. My name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish in Wayne County, Ohio. I was born in 1939. I married in 1958. I left quietly and at great cost when I was 31 years old. This channel is where I finally say the things I was taught, from the time I could understand language, that a good woman does not say. If you want to hear the truth about Amish life from someone who was inside it not as a child, but as a wife, as a mother, as a woman who kept silent for over a decade, then stay with me. Subscribe and tap the like button and tell me in the comments. Did you know that in 1959 a husband's rights over his wife's body were written into the community understanding as completely as any church ordinance? I want to know what you knew and what you didn't. Now let me take you back, because the year matters. It matters enormously. In 1959, in Wayne County, Ohio, in an Old Order Amish community governed by an ordinong that had not changed in any meaningful way since the 1800s, a husband's authority over his wife was not a metaphor. It was not a spiritual principle left open to interpretation. It was a daily, physical, practical reality, and every person in the community, every bishop, every deacon, every mother who had been a bride herself, understood exactly what it meant and said nothing to prepare you for it. Here is what I was taught before my wedding. A wife submits. That was the whole lesson. 2 words. Gelassenheit, yielding. The giving up of the self was the highest virtue in our world, not just spiritually, in every room of the house, in every hour of the day, and in particular in the bedroom in the dark, on the nights your husband decided. Here is what I was not taught, that I had any experience worth naming, that my body was mine in any meaningful sense, that the word no existed inside a marriage. That word did not exist. I am not speaking loosely. I mean that in the world I inhabited, in the theological framework I had breathed since birth, the concept of a wife declining her husband's physical demands was not a forbidden idea. It was not even an idea. It had no form. It was like trying to imagine a color that does not exist. The category was simply absent. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds to modern ears. My husband was not a monster. I want you to hold that alongside everything else I am about to tell you, because both things are true, and the truth only lives in the space between them. He was a man who had been formed by the same world that had formed me. He had been taught that his authority was God's design. He had been taught that a wife's submission was her holiness. He believed this with the same completeness that I believed the sky was blue. He was not doing something he had been told was wrong. He was doing something he had been told, by every voice he had ever trusted, was right. His name was Elias. He was a good farmer. He was not a cruel man in the barn or at the table. He had a long face, dark eyes, and hands that were rough from fence work before he was 12 years old. He made me laugh sometimes in the early years. He fixed things without being asked. He did not drink. By every measure, our community used to judge a husband. He was a good one. And every Sunday night, for 11 years, without asking, without pausing, without once in 11 years inquiring whether I was well or tired or in pain, he exercised what the community had told him was his right. Sunday nights specifically. That was the pattern in our community, rooted so deeply in practice that no one could tell me where it had started. Saturday was for bathing and preparation. Sunday was for church, for the long sermons about Gelassenheit and wifely duty, and Sunday night was for the marriage bed. It was almost liturgical. It had the rhythm of a church calendar. It was expected. It was assumed. It had been that way in our community for as long as anyone could remember, which in Amish life means it had been that way forever. I did not know in those first months that what I was experiencing had any other possibility. I did not know that a wife could speak. I did not know that something could hurt, and that the hurting could be addressed rather than endured. I was 19 years old. I'd completed school at 14. My entire education in the matter of marriage had been 2 words: a wife submits. My mother had held my hands the morning of my wedding and said, "Be a good wife, Anna." That was everything she gave me. Now here is what happened over the next 11 Sundays. What happened over the next 11 years I cannot carry in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. The names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Everything I cannot say here is there. What I can tell you is the shape of it. The first year, I believe the pain and the silence and the absence of any tenderness in those Sunday nights were my fault. I was not faithful enough. I was not yielded enough. I held something back, some small human resistance, some flicker of selfhood that I had not yet surrendered to God and to my husband as the ordinong required. I prayed about it. I confessed it to no one, because there was no category for confessing it. There was no language that would have allowed me to sit across from any woman I knew and describe what I needed to describe. I would have had to invent the words. I did not know how to invent them. The second year, we had our first child, a son, Jonas. His birth changed the texture of things without changing the structure of them. I was more tired. I was needed in more directions. Sunday nights continued. I want to tell you about a specific Sunday in the winter of 1961. I had been ill for most of the week. A deep chest cold that had me sleeping in the chair near the stove so I wouldn't wake the baby with my coughing. That Sunday morning I sat through 4 hours of church service in the cold of the Yoder family's barn, shaking slightly, holding Jonas, telling myself I was well enough. That Sunday night I was not well enough. I knew it. My body knew it with the simple clarity that a body in pain always knows. I lay down in that bed and I thought, tonight he will see. Tonight it will be clear. He came to bed. He did not see, or he saw, and the category did not exist that would have made that information matter. What I needed had no mechanism for becoming known. I had no words that were permitted. He had no framework for asking. The silence between us that night was not empty. It was full. It was full of everything the community had built to make sure it stayed exactly as it was. That is the night I began to understand that this was a system, not a flaw. A system. It had been constructed carefully over generations out of theology and custom and silence, and it worked exactly as it had been designed to work. I want to tell you about the older women, because this part still lives in me like something unresolved. There were women in my community who knew. Not everything, not the words for it, but they knew the shape of what a young bride was walking into. And some of them, the bravest ones, found ways to move information sideways in the way that forbidden knowledge always moves in closed communities. Sideways, in whispers, disguised as something else. My neighbor Edna, who was then about 60 years old, came to my kitchen 3 months after my wedding. She sat at my table and drank coffee and talked about gardening for 20 minutes. Then, as she was leaving, she put her hand briefly on my arm and said quietly, without looking at me, "Rest when you can, Anna. Rest is not weakness." And then she was gone. I was 20 years old. I did not understand what she was telling me for another 2 years. She was telling me that endurance was permitted, that rest, whatever form I could take it in, the small negotiations, the careful management, the ways a woman might move through an expected thing with as little cost as possible, that this was allowed. She was not telling me I could refuse. That word still did not exist. She was telling me I could survive, and she was giving me permission to be strategic about surviving. In 1961, for a woman in my community, that was as close to freedom as the air allowed. There were other moments like that. A mother-in-law who left a small jar of something on the nightstand after my second child was born, without explanation. A woman at a quilting frolic who said, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, "The body heals best when it is given patience," and then went back to her stitching. These were the messages, passed between women across decades, across kitchen tables and fence lines, and the long shared work of a community's daily life. They could not give us rights we had never been granted, but they gave us, sometimes, the knowledge that we were not alone in the shape of what we carried. By the time I was 25, I had 3 children, and I had developed what I can only describe now as a form of internal emigration. I was present in my life. I cooked, I sewed, I loved my children with a completeness that surprised me. I was a good neighbor and a faithful church member and a capable farmer's wife. And in the part of myself that lay under all of that, I had begun very slowly and with great caution to wonder. I want to be careful about when I name the wondering, because in my community, wondering was already a form of hochmut, pride, the sin that sat at the top of our sin hierarchy, worse than dishonesty, worse than almost anything else, was the belief that your own mind's questions mattered more than the community's settled answers. I had been trained against wondering since I could walk, and yet the wondering started with a small English book. One of my children had brought it home from somewhere, and in it there was a paragraph, just a paragraph, about a woman asking her husband for something. I do not remember what she asked him for. I remember that she asked. I remember sitting at the kitchen table reading that paragraph 3 times and feeling something shift inside my chest, something that had been there for years in a frozen form, cracking slightly. A woman asked for something, and it was written as ordinary, as the ordinary shape of a marriage. I was 26 years old the first time I understood that in some marriages, what happened on Sunday nights was a conversation and not only a fact. I did not leave immediately. You do not leave immediately when leaving means shunning, when it means your children watching you become a ghost in your own family, when it means your mother's door closing, when it means every relationship you have ever built in your entire life becoming a wall rather than a connection. You do not leave immediately. You survive. You develop your internal emigration into a whole landscape inside yourself. You find the small permissions. You find the Ednas. You find the ways to rest. I left when I was 30. I will not pretend it was clean or brave or swift. It was slow, and it cost things I am still, at my age, still paying the accounting on. My youngest was 7. I will not give you that story in this recording because I do not have the space to give it the honesty it requires. The Sundays holds it. I wrote it down so I would not have to carry it in my body anymore. What I will tell you is what I learned after. In therapy, which I did not begin until I was 33, I was given vocabulary I had lived my entire life without. Words like consent, which I had truly never heard applied to marriage. My therapist, a woman about my age who sat very still and listened very carefully, said something I have never stopped thinking about. She said, "The absence of no is not the presence of yes." I held that sentence in my hands for a week before I could look at it directly. The absence of no. Every Sunday night of 11 years. The absence of no, which I had believed was the same as yes, which I had been taught to believe was the same as holiness. I also learned later that what I had experienced was not exceptional by any measure, not unique to my husband or my community or my decade. Historians who study Amish life, and I have read them since leaving, note that coverture laws, the legal doctrine by which a wife's identity and rights were subsumed entirely into her husband's, had only officially ended in most American states in the early decades of the 20th century. But legal change and cultural change are not the same thing. In closed communities governed by their own internal codes, the ordinong moved on its own calendar. What the outside world had named and addressed and slowly, imperfectly, begun to change did not reach us, could not reach us. That was in some ways the whole point of the walls. My husband Elias died in 1987. We had been apart for 17 years by then. I learned of it through a letter from my youngest son, who had maintained a careful and difficult relationship with both of us. I sat with that letter for a long time. I felt grief, real grief, not for the Sunday nights, but for the man who had believed he was a good husband, and for the girl I had been who had believed she was a bad wife. I grieved the two of them. The belief system had failed us both, and he had never had the chance to learn that. I had. If you grew up in a world where your duty was so complete it left no room for your experience, I see you. If you were a bride who walked into a room holding only 2 words and a candle, I see you. If you spent years believing that the endurance was the holiness and that asking for something different made you proud, made you sinful, made you less, I am telling you now what no one told me in any room I was permitted to sit in for the first 30 years of my life. The endurance was not the holiness. The silence was not the virtue. You were a person in a system that had decided your personhood was an inconvenience to its design. That is not theology. That is architecture. And architecture can be named even when it cannot be changed from the inside. What happened over the next 11 years, I cannot carry in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Everything I cannot say here is there. If this reached something in you, leave me a comment. Tell me what you carried that you were never given words for. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me where you are from and what the silence looked like in the world you grew up inside. I am Anna. This is Hannah the Amish girl, and I have so many more truths waiting. The Sundays, description and pinned comment. The morning is yours if you decide it is.